Look, I think the bottom line is we're in a conflict. And I think we have to start talking about it that way. You know, a lot of time, most of the people who are up here now don't remember. You know, I was very young, obviously, at the end of the Cold War, but it's been about 30 years since there was another superpower on the earth that was in conflict with the United States.
Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson's Night. There's much fallout this evening, and there will be for months, stemming from the arraignment of the Republican frontrunner in Manhattan yesterday. And we're going to cover that in some detail. But we want to start tonight with a trend that we have noticed that might be worth knowing about, and it has to do with the dollar.
Welcome to today's news is about the BRICS group, which consists of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. These countries are emerging economies that have formed a political grouping to promote their economic interests and challenge the dominance of the Western countries in the global economy. The group has launched initiatives such as the establishment of the new development bank to provide financial and infrastructure or financial for infrastructures and sustainable development project in the member countries. The BRICS countries are considered to be a major force in the global economy, and their influence is likely to continue growing in the next years to come. If you did not know, I want to jump into this video so that you can understand what we are talking about today.
For nearly 80 years since the end of the Second World War, the US dollar has effectively been the currency of the world. For our entire lifetimes, there was virtually no place on the entire globe you could go that would turn down a 20. Andrew Jackson's face beside the famous seal of the US Treasury was probably America's best-known export. From Dar es Salaam to Sri Lanka to the smallest gold mining outpost in the Amazon basin, every shopkeeper on earth recognized a $20 bill. The dollar was universal, and not just universal in commerce, though the majority of international transactions were conducted in dollars, but universally held as a long-term store of value globally. The world's central banks stockpiled US dollars, far more than any other currency. Now, most Americans may not have known that, or they did, but it doesn't matter whether they knew it. It was very good for everyone who lives here. Because there were so many US dollars in circulation outside of the country, the cost of borrowing money inside the country remained artificially low. And that's one of the reasons that in this country, America, middle-class people could buy their own homes. The U.S. government, meanwhile, was able to run up astronomical debts without many obvious consequences. Now, from time to time, the Congress would debate something called the debt ceiling, but it was abstract. For most people, the entire topic didn't seem very relevant to their lives because for most of that time, it really wasn't. America printed the U.S. dollar, we controlled the global reserve currency, and that meant that for us, money was cheap. We had privileges that nobody else in the world had. E.J. Antoni and Peter St. Onge wrote an incisive piece in the Daily Caller last week that explains part of why this happened. Quote, a critical feature of a reserve currency is its apolitical nature, which Biden is now gutting. After both parties in Washington destroyed the dollar's stability with inflation, now the Biden administration has chosen to wield the dollar as a weapon. Together, these two factors send a message to foreigners, which is they should get out while they still can. In response to Russia's war with Ukraine, the U.S. froze the dollar reserves of Russia's central bank. To be clear, these were not American assets. These were dollars owned by the Russian central bank and the Russian people. The seizure was intended to cause bank runs and collapse Russia's credit system. It didn't work. Instead, it exposed the Biden administration's willingness to violate the trillions of dollars that foreigners rightfully own. The danger of this precedent is difficult to overstate, end quote. Now, all of us saw that happening, but you couldn't say anything because Russia, bad. We can't even watch their hockey teams. All right. But what do you think happened next as we were jumping up and down and talking about Winston Churchill? Well, smart foreigners, and there are some, believe it or not, started to dump the U.S. dollar. Why? Because the U.S. dollar was no longer a reliable store of value. Suddenly, it was a political weapon that could be wielded at will against anyone who held it. So what if you had a border dispute with one of your neighbors that the State Department hadn't authorized? Or what if you accidentally criticized transgender theology and irritated the Human Rights Campaign?
I'm going to try to help explain to the American people that defeating the Russians in Ukraine is the single most important event going on in the world right now.
Defeating the Russians in Ukraine is not the single most important event in the world from the perspective of the United States. It's not even number 15 on the list. It's way below ending the importation of fentanyl into this country, and it's way, way below preserving the strength of the U.S. dollar. But if Mitch McConnell and Joe Biden and the rest of these reckless leaders have their way, an increasing number of countries will do what so many have already done, which is begin to reject the U.S. dollar. And what will happen then? Well, all those dollars will come home, and the value of our currency will plummet even further. And that will lead to poverty across the United States, and that will lead to the typical political and cultural volatility that inevitably follows economic collapse. Disaster.
I would like to get your information, your reaction, and your feedback on whatever is happening in regard of BRICS. Okay?
Here now, Florida Senator Marco Rubio. Senator, how are you? All right, Senator, President Xi said he's preparing for war. They have been ramping up their military now for over a decade, and now they increased their defense budget another 7.6%. And President Xi said he's preparing for war. I assume it's against us. Is that a wrong assumption?
Well, it's not against Belgium or Luxembourg. Look, I think the bottom line is we're in a conflict. And I think we have to start talking about it that way. You know, a lot of time, most of the people are up here now don't remember. You know, I was very young, obviously, at the end of the Cold War, but it's been about 30 years since there was another superpower on the earth that was in conflict with the United States. And we are back in that place. And we need to stop pretending like that's not the case. Now, I hope it's never an armed conflict, but it's a conflict at every level you can imagine. And I think, look, we have a couple problems. Number one, the White House, the Biden administration is filled with a bunch of traditional, conventional political figures that grew up over the last 20 years talking about cooperating with China. We saw how that worked out. They took all of our jobs, they took all of our factories, they got rich, we got poorer, their middle class grew, our middle class shrunk. They make things and we don't. That was, but I think the other problem we have, and you've alluded to this, is these guys in China, they watch TV. I mean, they watch TV broadcasts of what's happening in America. And I hate saying this because I don't want to encourage our enemies, but you turn on the TV and you watch Joe Biden speak on any topic on any day, that does not inspire respect or apprehension on the part of our adversaries. They're probably saying, now's the time to strike, guys.
Well, they definitely are doing that. And look at this new alliance that is emerging. I call it a new axis of evil. I mean, you got Russia, you got China. Now they bring in the Iranians. They broker a deal with Saudi Arabia. Now they're brokering another deal with Saudi Arabia and Syria. And they're telling Kevin McCarthy not to meet with an allied leader. And then what are the consequences for the balloon spying? What are the consequences for taking out an American drone like Putin did?
There have been no consequences, and I think that's part of the challenge that we have on our hands here. Look, it goes beyond these things. That just today, Brazil, in our hemisphere, largest country in the Western Hemisphere south of us, cut a trade deal with China. They're going to, from now on, do trade in their own currencies, get right around the dollar. They're creating a secondary economy in the world, totally independent of the United States. We won't have to talk about sanctions in 5 years because there'll be so many countries transacting in currencies other than the dollar that we won't have the ability to sanction them. As we are sitting here, focused on some of these nuttiness that's going on, people that are basically dedicating their lives in this country to ensuring that it is legal to mutilate children, to do drag shows in schools. They dedicate their lives to this, and we have another superpower that basically wants to become the world's dominant power at our expense, and these people don't want to focus on it. We had some person on The View yesterday say that our criminal justice system is no better than what China is doing with its genocide of Uyghur Muslims. So we better wake up, or we're going to live in a very different world than the one we've been used to, and it's going to happen very fast.
We have military installations now that have drag queen shows. You know that. I played that earlier.
Yeah, but I mean, it's part of I don't know if you saw this poll yesterday. I don't put a lot of stock into the polls, but if you think about all of the values that make you a strong society, family, children's, patriotism, all of that is diminished. The only thing that matters now, the thing that has gone up, is people care about money, and I'm not saying that doesn't matter, but China knows it, and they use it against us. And they know that in America, they believe one day there are enough people to pressure their politicians because they care more about buying cheap shirts off an app from China than they do about standing up for their own country. At some point, we need to figure out that we are Americans. Someone needs to stand up for this country. If we don't, no one will. And that the world is a better place because of America, and it'll be a worse place if America declines.
Big Cast Podcast.